Good evening, everyone. My name is Florentine Strzelczyk, and I'm the Provost and Vice President Academic here at Western University. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to tonight's Clissold Lecture. Before we get started, let's begin with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Shonanton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and the Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. I want to say a few things about tonight's Clissold Lecture before we get underway. All of those are quite personal. We are celebrating Carol Off and her contributions tonight. It's been such a thrill to meet you in person. First off, I'm a huge fan of Carol Off and As It Happens, like many of us here. Why am I such a big fan? I'm an immigrant to this country, and I came as an international PhD exchange student who ended up staying in Canada. When I first came to Canada, I had studied in Europe politics, history, film, and I was interested in anything Canadian culture and Canadian society. How to learn about such a vast and internally so diverse country. I found CBC programming was actually a key to understand better the place that would be my future home. And I still think of CBC today as the glue that keeps this diverse, large country together. Among the many programs I listened to, As It Happens became one of my favorites. I came in the early 1990s here to Canada, and I remember Michael Enright, then Barbara Budd, Mary Lou Finley, and then Carol Off, of course, as the host and co-host, and so on. Carol was my favorite, and I was kind of sad too when you left the show not so long ago. Felt like an end of an era to me in many ways, because I felt that As It Happens had chronicled somehow my journey to become a Canadian. I loved your voice, Carol. Velvety, suave, smart, sometimes ironic and sarcastic, always generous, I thought, in the conclusions and your judgment, and with a great sense of humor. And that is something that you learn as a foreigner to this country. The sense of humor that Canadians have is very different than the sense of humor that people in other places of the world have. I loved Carol's voice as much as I loved the show. It was this quirky mix of, great interviews, great reporting, critiques, and then also the unusual and odd in many ways, right? Some of the interviews, I just loved that because it celebrated Canadian culture. It informed me of what I felt I needed to know, and also gave me that perspective that Canadians have, how they view the rest of the world. And I thought it was so, it became really an anchor point where I would make sure that I learned English and also understood Canadian culture and history a little bit better. So it's such a thrill that I made it just back now, just a couple of minutes ago, from Ottawa, where I was stranded last night, and I could actually come here in person, meet Carol, and I'm so excited about today's lecture. Thank you for having me, and thanks, Carol, for coming.
Thank you, Provost Strzelczyk. And my name is Jeremy Copeland. I'm the chair of the MMJC program here at Western. And thank you, everyone, for coming here today. It's so nice to be in this beautiful room and back to doing a Clissold Lecture in person for the first time in years. It takes a lot of people to pull off an event like this, and I just want to say a quick thank you to some of them. First of all, thank you to the Faculty of Arts and Humanities for collaborating with FIMS on this event, in particular to Dean Michael Milday for being part of this. And also thank you to Jessica Shargol. From FIMS is a bunch of thank yous. Dean Lisa Henderson, Becky Blue, Paul Buckley-Golder, Ryan Travers, Jacob Anstey, Sydney Young, Caroline Jones, Matt Ward, and Charlotte McClellan. Thank you for all the work you put into and are also currently putting into making this event possible. For those watching online, you can submit questions for Carol at the end of her talk, and we will relay those to Carol as well. For everybody who's here today, we will have a reception right after the talk and the Q&A. It will be just behind this room, so basically underneath the people who are in the balcony. There's a room under there, and please join us and Carol for the reception. The Clissold Lecture is one of the highlights of the year at FIMS, and it's especially true for the Masters of Media in Journalism and Communication program. It's an important opportunity for Canada's leading journalists to give Western, the London community, our online audience, a deeper understanding of the critical importance and changing practice of journalism. The Clissold Lecture commemorates the life and work of Edward Clissold. He was one of London's most important early editors and journalists. He retired as an editor from the London Advertiser after 33 years on staff there. In 1984, the estate of Clissold's grandson, Robert Blount, and his wife, Rose, gave a bequest to what was then Western's Graduate School of Journalism, and this annual lecture series commemorates the life and work of Edward Clissold. It is my privilege now to introduce our guest today, and I don't know how I'm supposed to sum up a career like Carol Off's in 2 minutes, but I'm going to do the best I can. And I'll just give you some of the headlines of her extraordinary work that she's done both as a journalist and away from the microphone as well. Carol Off is a multi-award-winning journalist, author, and broadcaster. She got her start as a reporter right here at Western, writing for the Gazette, which a number of my students start there as well. And she studied English literature right here in this very building, and is a graduate of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, mixing up my faculties. As a television reporter, Carol Off covered conflicts in the Middle East, Haiti, the Balkans, and Afghanistan. She's covered events across Europe, across Asia, Canada, the United States, the former Soviet Union, and many other places as well. She's written 4 books that came out of her work as a reporter. She's been awarded honorary doctorate degrees from the Royal Military College of Canada and from Western. And until February, as you know, she had spent more than 15 years as host of CBC Radio's As It Happens, where she interviewed about 25,000 people. Here's something that Carol might not know. One of her former producers is a graduate of the School of Journalism at FIMS, the program here. And 7 years ago, my former student did an internship at As It Happens. She has been there ever since. So I asked Katie to describe Carol, and this is what she had to say. Carol is the definition of cool. She's unbelievably intelligent and can hold a politician to account like no other. I've sat across the glass from her in the studio broadcast hundreds of times, and I still come out amazed at her interviewing skills. She's also not afraid to laugh at herself and fully commit to an interview about a woman who makes jewelry out of moose turds. And yes, I said moose turds. Carol's talk today is called The Autocrats Are at the Gate, and we're busy watching cat videos. And the timing of her talk about the threat that autocrats pose to democracy, unfortunately, couldn't be better. Earlier this year, we saw Vladimir Putin launch a war of aggression against Ukraine, and less than 24 hours ago, Donald Trump announced that he's running to be the next president of the United States again. So please join me in giving Carol Off a warm welcome back to Western.
Great. Should I test this? Oh, it's working. Good, good. I'm not really accustomed to microphones, so I'm just going to pour some water here. Thank you, Jeremy, for that great introduction, and Florence, thank you for that. I'm worried about Florence, though, because if you learned your language from As It Happens, and you learned Canadian culture from As It Happens, it's fairly warped. It's because at the heart of every As It Happens journalist, including Katie, is a 10-year-old who is always looking for a way to say poo and pee. If we could say penis at any time on the show, we were so excited. We're just really immature. And so I'm not sure. I think there may be something more highbrow you might have turned to than what we were doing, but I totally appreciate that. I also truly appreciate not just doing the Clissold Lecture, but also that these two departments that are two sides or two halves of my soul are joined together, because journalism and the arts and humanities departments, these are two things that fused for me when I was at Western, working both as one of the editors on the Gazette, but also at the same time studying English literature, which I loved. And so I have a feeling that things came full circle for this, so it's lovely. I feel unworthy to be doing this Clissold Lecture. If you've seen the people who've done it, I'm not even in that class at all, so this is great. But I need to clear the air because I think there's some fake news around this lecture that needs to be clarified. It's quite important. And that's that I love cat videos. I do. In fact, I love cats. In fact, I have family members here will attest the fact I probably love cats too much. I like dog videos, but cat videos, not cute ones, like the ones about really arrogant cats who do things they shouldn't, and usually two dogs. I like, of course, after cat videos, any parodies of Elon Musk are quite delightful. So either way, I can escape, and you need these things, right? We all need them to, as a palate cleanser, dealing with what we are dealing with these days. And after, I don't know if any of you watched the speech last night of Donald Trump announcing his renewed candidacy, but it would make you want to go into a dark room and watch cat videos for the rest of the time. But following last week's midterm elections, the assessment of many Americans, as you know, was that democracy had somehow dodged a bullet. I think it's hard to overestimate the threat that election represented, not just to the US political landscape, but the effect it could have on governments in many countries, including ours. Hundreds of candidates in last week's midterm elections claimed that the vote that defeated Donald Trump for president was rigged. There's no evidence to that effect. It's not true. And those running in the election know that. Those Americans whom they hope shared a collective fear that the country, over which they have enjoyed supremacy for generations, is changing, and that they believe that they will be the losers in that changing America, those are the people that those candidates were trying to appeal to. The scene in Washington on January 6th, 2021, the attack on the US Capitol, is no doubt seared into the imaginations of people around the world and the people in this room. That's because a smooth transition of power following a free and fair election is one of the most important hallmarks of a democracy. The insurrection, the attempt to overthrow those results, was a warning to people of that country and to all functioning democracies that our political systems are fragile. It was a message that President Xi Jinping of China and President Vladimir Putin in Russia took some delight in. The evidence that democracy is unstable, that leaders should govern with an iron hand, that our systems don't work. It's also a warning that we live in a perilous time, a time when we're in a perfect storm of challenges that are political, demographic, and most important of all, environmental. One Twitter comment the morning after the US midterm elections read, "Democracy lives to fight another day." The fact that there was no red wave of Republican victories was hardly a consolation, given the fact that so many people voted for the extreme wing of the Republican Party. When a hurricane is expected to obliterate your landscape, but then only wipes out half your villages, and not all of them, I don't regard that as much of a relief. And I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer here, though I am. But the Democratic victories, such as the one in Wisconsin, was because of the extraordinary voter turnout. 380% more young people voted in this election than in the last one. Good work, Gen Z, or Gen Z, depending what border you're in. I had no vested interest in which party won, except for the extremists, whose platforms called for the end of reproductive rights, environmental laws, for the dismantling of social safety nets, and in many cases declared that if elected, they would rewrite laws to ensure that only Republicans would be elected in the future. That's called dictatorship. As one anti-Trump Republican said last week, the election in the US was between Team Normal and Team Crazy. Team Normal won. But Team Crazy is still out there, and it has a lot of support in the US, around the world, and in Canada. There has been a seismic shift in the political landscape, and I think things will never go back to normal. Lately, I've been reminded of a favorite short story of mine that I first read many years ago. In fact, read it probably in this building. A story by Ray Bradbury, who wrote the story in the 1950s, just years after the defeat of fascism in a war that killed millions of people. But the story, A Sound of Thunder, as the title is actually set in the year 2055. Bradbury imagined that by that time, people would be able to travel back in time. His protagonist, Eccles, has paid $10,000 to go on a hunting expedition. And just as a humorous aside, he paid for it with a check that he wrote. So obviously Bradbury could imagine time travel, but couldn't imagine a cashless society, which is, you'd think that would be the other way around. Anyway, the $10,000 hunting expedition was to go hunting in the age of the dinosaurs. The agency, called Time Safari Inc., allows travelers to return to prehistoric Earth. Eccles is very excited that in a few hours he will be able to hunt and to kill a Tyrannosaurus Rex. He arrives at the travel departure office on an interesting day. There's just been an election in the United States, and the Americans have elected a new president. A man named Keith has won, and everyone seems very relieved by this news. Keith is a political moderate, a progressive. He's defeated a man named Deutscher, who ran for presidential office under the banner of fascism. And it's no accident that Deutscher is a German name. Our man, Eccles, is very happy about the results. He tells the clerk at the desk, "Makes you think, if the election had gone badly yesterday, I might be here now running away from those results. Thank God Keith won. He'll make a fine president of the United States." "Yes," the man behind the counter desk says, "we're lucky. If Deutscher had gotten in, we'd have the worst kind of dictatorship. There is an anti-everything man for you, a militarist, anti-Christ, anti-human, anti-intellectual." But at that moment, the tour guide arrives and gives Eccles a very specific, informed set of rules for time travel. He warns that travelers should never step off the elevated pathway as they pursue their prey. The animals for the hunt have been pre-selected and are known to be just about to meet their fate in any event, so killing the dinosaur will not alter evolution. But the guide cautions that the slightest alteration in the past can have huge consequences for the present. The voyage begins, and Eccles is told they should not touch anything when they arrive, as he's transported 66 million years into the past. The doors open in the late Cretaceous period of planet Earth. Eccles finds this exciting but also terrifying. As he pursues his pre-selected beast, he panics. He steps off the path and he briefly stumbles into the jungle. The safari escorts are furious with Eccles. He's brought back to the path, and soon after they all return to the year 2055. As the doors of the time machine open, Eccles notices immediately that a number of small things have changed. People look slightly different. There's a certain anxiety in the air. There's a new smell, something acrid. The letters on the board are not quite the same, and he has a horrible feeling about this. He turns to the clerk with whom he had the earlier discussion about the presidential election results, and he demands to know who won. The man behind the desk laughs. He said, "Are you joking? You know very well. Deutscher, of course. Who else? Not that fool weakling Keith. We got an Iron Man now, a man with guts." Eccles is shocked. How is it possible? A fascist for president of the United States. He looks at his feet, caked with moss, slime, and mud, and there he discovers, in its entirety, a butterfly, crushed under the sole of his boot. So lately I've had this unsettled feeling that someone in the future, when they have time machines, has traveled back, perhaps to the 1950s, to the era in which Bradbury wrote his story, and some DNA of democracy, some key piece of an evolving social contract has been extinguished. Some jackboot has crushed a nascent, yet incomplete, movement towards civil liberties and justice. And that trajectory of progress, of pluralism, of tolerance, of inclusion, of liberal democracy that I have followed since my earliest political awareness has shifted course. And the flapping of those butterfly wings that would allow for the world I dreamed of since a young person is no longer evolving as it should. It isn't just the sick feeling I get when I read the news, but more, it's the revelation that so many people are, like the clerk in the Times Safari office, believing that this new course we're on isn't new at all, but is one that was always destined to be. It's not just that up is now down or in is out, as George Orwell's character describes. It's the belief on the part of so many people, Americans, Europeans, increasingly Canadians, this was always the course we really intended to be on. That the inclusion of others, the acceptance of those who are not straight, white Christians, defies what they believe are the true values of their country. We all know that societies have always had intolerance and a fear of change, but the issue now is that so many countries have political leaders, both in power and in opposition, who play on that fear and intolerance, and a desire for President Deutscher as their strong man to lead to a more authoritarian and autocratic form of government. It might be useful to have some brief definition of these terms. Oh, and by the way, just another aside, in case you thought the seminar was for the Aristocrats, someone actually thought because the cats and autocrats, and they put it together. And if this is not about the Disney movie, if you thought it was and you want to leave now, you're perfectly okay. But it's a charming movie, actually. We might watch it at some point. But somehow, we're going to stick with the autocrats, if that's all right. I'm not a political scientist either, and so I yield to learned academics who might want to dispute or refine my definitions. I use these words as a journalist. They are my understanding of the terms as I've seen them played out in our coverage of world events and as I've used them for decades. Autocrat is usually defined as power in the hands of an individual or group without much or any outside constraint. This is also common to authoritarian regimes, and I reckon you can usually use one term or the other interchangeably, but these terms are also on a spectrum. I often use the term ultranationalist to describe the politics of countries such as Hungary or Poland. Ultranationalism plays on mythology, as well as on ideas of cultural and racial superiority. These are not autocratic states, at least not yet. In fact, so many of the authoritarian-leaning or authoritarian-trending world leaders are actually elected in some kind of political process, and they're often very popular. Democracy, for all its flaws, is still alive and well in Canada, and seems to be so in the United States. Democracy is a system for solving differences without resorting to violence. It relies on compromise between sometimes wildly divergent interests. It uses complex systems to achieve its goals, like institutions, courts, the public sector, rule of law, international agreements. Power and decision-making is not or should not be concentrated in the office of the leader. Suffice it to say, democratic government doesn't always satisfy everyone. Occasionally it satisfies no one. But as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system, but until someone has a better idea, it's the best we've got. I'm old enough to remember old-fashioned autocracies, when regimes put their populations into a state of constant fear of arrest or death. On any given day, news agencies I worked for covered the excesses of despots like General Pinochet, Pol Pot, or Mobutu Sese Seko. Military dictatorships are often unstable, and we had a segment on the radio program I worked for that was dedicated to that. It was called News with the Coups. Power changed so often that we actually had quite a long segment. I remember a demonstrator also who was on Parliament Hill every day. He would yell, "Noriega, Ceausescu, Mulroney, 2 down, 1 to go." Now, we all know that Prime Minister Mulroney was not a dictator, but lots of other people were. And when they fell hard. One of the most influential political movements I witnessed as a journalist was the triumph of people power in the Philippines. In the 1980s, a strong movement of citizens actually overthrew a tyrannical government led by the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. People power spread throughout Asia, much to the alarm of Washington, where an attempt to overthrow right-wing governments was regarded as communist subversion. But activists of other countries saw an opportunity to toss off the yoke of dictatorship, and they followed suit. The Cold War allowed for US-backed right-wing governments to run roughshod over people's rights, but Soviet-backed dictators on the left were no different. Opposition leaders disappeared into prisons. Journalists were murdered. Death squads roamed neighborhoods. Any dissent brought tanks into the streets. In the olden days, authoritarian governments were conspicuous in their repression of rights and freedoms. Those regimes still exist. China and Iran come to mind. But I think we now face a different type of tyranny, one that doesn't need tanks and prisons and government death squads. I specifically mentioned the Philippines because I want to introduce you or remind you of an extraordinary journalist from that country. Maria Ressa has recently won the Nobel Peace Prize for her courageous reporting. But that recognition hasn't stopped the government of the Philippines from continuing its campaign to shut her up. Maria is the founder of an online news site called Rappler. She first came on the radar of the Filipino government when she reported on the campaign of an elected president, Rodrigo Duterte, and he decided to have alleged drug dealers executed on the street and without trial. Rappler reported that. It was part of Duterte's tough on crime policy, and it's worthy of note that Donald Trump admired it, and he has said he'd like to do the same thing in the United States. The Duterte government also began to institute new media laws in order to shut Maria and Rappler's journalism down, threatening her with lawsuits, closures, and fines. It was a reversal of all the gains Filipinos had won with people power decades ago. But Maria was just getting started. During the campaign that re-elected Duterte to the office of president, Rappler exposed something that the public was slowly becoming aware of around the world: troll farms, online manipulators who are guns for hire. They set up hundreds or even thousands of fake social media accounts to influence elections. US security agencies have no doubt that online trolls and bots, probably out of St. Petersburg, Russia, not only worked the election that got Donald Trump elected, but they probably had a large influence on the outcome. But we also know that they have had enormous influence on elections in other countries as well. Canada's security watchers warn about that influence here. Rappler did a full investigation and revealed the network of trolls and bots that Duterte had used and paid for. President Duterte did not like this. His judiciary criminalized her work, and she now faces numerous charges and civil sanctions. Her lawyers have told her she faces the possibility of 100 years in prison. She's not yet 60. When I spoke with Maria recently, she was confident that she could beat the politicized charges. What rattled her more was an online campaign of threat and harassment that eats at her daily. We saw recently a narrow defeat of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. If you don't follow politics there, Bolsonaro's government posed one of the greatest threats to our unstable climate of any country in the world. He allowed for the wide exploitation of the rainforest, opening indigenous and protected lands for mining and forestry. Environmentalists and local politicians were threatened, and some of them were killed. Bolsonaro called journalists who opposed him enemies of the people. There were 66 acts of extreme aggression against Brazilian reporters just last year, all of whom had given negative reports of Bolsonaro's policies. Women were especially targeted. They were threatened with rape, and they were doxxed along with their families. One prominent female reporter was devastated when Bolsonaro supporters posted a photo of her 6-year-old daughter giving out her location. Bolsonaro cheered them on. India is one of the liveliest and most vibrant democracies I know, or it was. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is plowing ahead with changes to laws and institutions that's turning the country into an autocracy. According to Freedom House, under Prime Minister Modi's watch, there has been threats to human rights groups, intimidation of journalists and activists, attacks against Muslims. This, they add, has led to a deterioration of political and civil liberties in the country. Freedom House says India's fall from the upper ranks of free nations could have a more damaging effect on much of the world's democratic standards. In Turkey, 160 media outlets have been forced to close just in the past 5 years. Human Rights Watch reports that the government of President Erdogan is targeting any institution or part of society that stands in the way of his wide-ranging efforts to reshape Turkish society. Countries throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America are trending in the same direction. Most of the world's populations are in countries facing elections where they could end up under autocratic governments. Maria Ressa believes that we are 2 years away from the possible death of democracy in most of the world. But the authoritarianism that's now rattling the gate is a new kind of beast. As thuggish as is Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, he's an old-fashioned kind of despot. Most wannabe autocrats don't send agents to poison their enemies or arrange to have them fall out of windows, as Putin does. They don't put people under surveillance like China. They also don't disappear people by the tens of thousands as Argentina and Chile once did. They're not throwing people to their horrifying deaths from airplanes and helicopters as they once did, or sending tanks and death squads into the streets. Most autocrats don't have to do that anymore. Social media and online technology does it for them. Why would you send your police to the doors of a journalist when you can hire trolls to threaten them with sexual violence and the kidnapping of their children? Why would you bother to jail your opposition leaders when you can declare them enemies of the people on Twitter and release your hounds like the overwrought followers of QAnon who will go to the door of a politician like Nancy Pelosi looking to kill her? You no longer have to send your thugs into the offices of newspapers and trash the printing presses. That's so last century. Now you farm out your own news with fake stories and false narratives. The more divisive and sensational, the better, since it can only help the share price of Meta. You don't have to stuff ballot boxes or rig elections. Just hire a bot farm to send people to the wrong polling stations or convince them that their vote will be stolen if they chose the wrong candidate. Why have parades and goose-stepping soldiers as a show of power when you could have millions of friends on Facebook who can be swayed and sway others for you? Why would you bother to win the hearts and minds of an electorate when you can simply stoke their fear and anxiety that government is part of an international conspiracy to deny your rights and to replace you with immigrants? Who needs the fear of gulags when you have the tools of Google? The FBI posted ahead of the midterm elections that actors use publicly available, this is a quote, actors use publicly available and dark web media channels, online journals, messaging applications, spoofed websites, emails, text messages, and fake online personas on US and foreign social media platforms to spread and amplify false claims. These foreign actors may create and knowingly disseminate false claims and narratives regarding voter suppression, voter or ballot fraud, and also false information intended to undermine confidence in election processes. End of warning. But what do you do when it's the political leaders themselves who are driving these false narratives? When Jair Bolsonaro calls journalists the enemy of the people, and then reporters find death threats and sexual assault messages on Facebook. When political leaders in the US describe the January 6th insurrection as heroic and the people's voice, even as they comb the halls of Congress looking for people to lynch. Insurrectionists who also believe, because they're told, that journalists are now fair game. UNESCO recently published a review of online violence towards women journalists. It's called The Chilling. Of the hundreds of women surveyed around the world, 3/4, 3 in 4, said they had experienced online violence. 1 in 5 women journalists said the online violence they experienced had translated into physical attacks. Almost half of the women said they believed the attacks were orchestrated. The women determined that Facebook was the most unsafe social media platform that they knew. Twice as many attacks there as they saw on Twitter, though I think Elon Musk's Twitter seems to be doing its darndest to take first place. So many of those journalists now self-censor or have left the business altogether. Maria Ressa is constantly under threat. As political leaders call her the enemy, she receives as many as 90 death threats per hour. When her news organization took apart the sources of disinformation in the Philippines, they found that bot farms in other countries produced most of them. But the bot farms and trolls were paid for by the Duterte government. Many Filipino journalists, activists, opposition leaders were hopeful that recent presidential elections would return the Philippines to team normal. But somewhere, a time machine rumbled into activity. And somewhere, a butterfly beat its wings for the last time. Because there was Marcos, back again. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., also known as Bong Bong Marcos, is now the president, the son of the former dictator. It's as though the 1980s had never happened. We are living in perilous times. The 9/11-induced wars created waves of humanity on the move from the Middle East, Afghanistan, and North Africa. Displaced people and refugees by the tens of millions are looking for some corner of stability. Drug cartels and organized crime have induced whole populations of people to flee their homes. And the biggest motivator of all, climate change, is already driving mass numbers of people from the warming regions of the world. It all creates an emotional and unstable environment. And it creates what's known in the advertising world and the boardrooms of Twitter and TikTok as FUD. F-U-D, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. FUD creates divisions and polarizes people. Who then can you believe? Who can you trust? Can you trust your government, your political leaders, your neighbor? Or that the other is about to replace you, push you from your place in society? The COVID pandemic certainly exaggerated these emotions. Isolation, loss of control, suspicion of foreign influences. And the internet told you that the threat was exaggerated or a trap to get you vaccinated with some poison. The problem is, we no longer have facts that we all agree on. Without a shared understanding of the facts, you no longer have truth. And without truth, there is no trust. And if there's no trust, society starts to unravel. People now get most of their information online, and the go-to source of that info is social media. The tech companies have done their own research, and they know that lies wrapped in hate and anger travel faster and further than the truth, and that makes them money. The rule of the game is engagement. In order to make money, they need you to stay on their sites. Rational, thoughtful news just won't do it. Emotional, irrational content keeps you online. This is absolutely how it works. This is absolutely how they make their money. The angrier you are, the better. Cat videos are simply bait. Mark Zuckerberg knows what makes you tick. And more important, he knows what makes you click. Does he care? Maria Ressa once confronted him with that question. She told him that 97% of Filipinos get their understanding of the world from Facebook. Does he understand that? Does he grasp the responsibility? Zuckerberg responded, well, that's very interesting, Maria, But I have to know, what's wrong with that other 3%? Maria says she laughed at the time, but she's no longer laughing. In a recent interview I had with her, she described Facebook as evil. But what about trends in Europe? What about leaders who claim they are democratic or that they support managed democracy? Self-described illiberal states, such as Hungary, are the role model. The fundamental law of Hungary, as it's called, is tasked with turning back the clocks, to return to some mythical time of European Christian patriarchy, when marriage was between a man and a woman, and the role of families was to produce children. Abortion is now outlawed. Immigration is highly restricted in an effort to preserve ethnic Hungarian identity. Poland has similar laws and restrictions. Its government is anti-immigrant, anti-feminist, and homophobic. Ruling party members have full control over state media, so there's no dissent. These European leaders are wannabe autocrats. Donald Trump is also a wannabe autocrat. On the spectrum, he falls squarely into the mold of what's called populist, as do the European leaders. Though it's been around for a long time, populism is a political movement that's now spreading like wildfire. Populists claim to represent the will of the people, but the real, authentic people. They offer to defend these real people against perceived enemies of the people. The enemies of the people are those who are not the people. You are among the people if you support the populist. If you do not, then you are against the people. The populist and the people are one and the same. You're with them or you're against them. For Donald Trump, the enemies of the people are euphemistically described as elites, gatekeepers, institutions, foreign entities, and those who are part of what he calls, and many others call, the deep state. Journalists, judges, political opposition, technocrats, those in civil society are among the suspects. But for populists, often the enemy is understood to be immigrants, Muslims, Jews, feminists, LGBTQ, the racialized, the other. The rhetoric of populists often alludes to members of these minorities without actually naming them. The anti-woke movement, as it's called, is code. The great replacement theory is code. While it has the veneer of something academic and tested, it actually alludes to the belief that there's a secret plot to replace white people with immigrants. Populism is to politics what Hallmark greeting cards are to poetry. It appeals to the emotional rather than the rational. It's sentimental and it's very effective, especially on social media. It appeals to the same sentimentality as the ultranationalists, and that there is some pure nation that's been polluted that can be restored by the populist. Donald Trump and his likely successor, Ron DeSantis, play to these same tropes. They demonize journalists, claim they are upholding traditional family values, while they turn back the clock on so many hard-earned rights and liberties of a complex society. The Republican movement that's behind MAGA has made it clear that they have no interest in democracy, and they have stated as such. Democracy, it's believed, gets in the way of personal freedom because it puts the collective ahead of the individual. Mask mandates and COVID protocols would be among those collective ideas that get in the way of those personal freedoms. It means that other people have to be taken into consideration. There's a long history of this tension between freedom and democracy. The recent convoy takeover of Ottawa is a case in point. Those in the occupation insisted that they were there in the name of freedom, and they were against a system of government that works for the collective. They believed it had denied them freedom. When the convoyistas, as my friend calls them, arrived in Ottawa last January, calling for the Prime Minister to be arrested and the government to be dissolved, a number of politicians came out to show their support, even though people in the movement threatened violence, even though the convoy leader said Justin Trudeau should catch a bullet, even though the convoy in Alberta had an arsenal of weapons. The Ottawa part of it brought bouncy castles and hot tubs, but if you're following the inquiry in Ottawa, you'll know that the occupation of downtown Ottawa was extremely sinister and menacing. I know you're wondering if I'm going to come around to talking about Pierre Poilievre, and I am. He is a populist, and he looks to score points, much as the others do. But I don't yet know what his politics or his intentions are. He would appear to have taken several pages from the Donald Trump handbook. He plays on the anger we saw in Ottawa last January. He supports the convoy movement, though he says he doesn't support those who break the law. Like all populists, he offers simple solutions to complex problems. He says if he became prime minister, when he becomes prime minister, he will fire all the gatekeepers. That's a quote. Without ever saying who those gatekeepers are. He very effectively uses the internet to warn people of dark international conspiracies that will disrupt the lives of the people. The World Economic Forum is an international NGO based in Switzerland. Mr. Poilievre claims it's part of an international conspiracy. He speaks often of the elites, those who are the enemies of the people. Those are the ruling elites, the wealthy elites, the journalists. He uses dog whistle slogans such as he's going to get rid of woke culture and make Canada free again. He never defines those terms. Poilievre would make federal grants for universities conditional on whether they uphold free speech on campus, though he offers few details nor says how he will determine free speech on campus. Poilievre suggests that universities have become averse to discussion and debate, leading to the resignations of professors like Jordan Peterson. Mr. Poilievre's plan includes appointing free speech guardians to campuses whose job it would be to monitor a university's compliance and investigate allegations of censorship. Those guardians would recommend reductions in federal grants to universities that the guardians believe are failing to protect free speech. Mr. Poilievre's largest pledge is that he will restore Canada as a free society, where we are not saddled with high taxes, where you are able to raise your kids with your own values. A lot to unpack there. Freedom from vaccines you don't want. Freedom to speak without fear. Again, a big load to unpack there. Freedom to worship God in your way. But we've seen all of these pledges around the MAGA Republicans in the United States, and then they get translated into don't say gay laws in Florida, book banning in Texas, and the dismissal of teachers and librarians. I do not know if Mr. Poilievre is going there. I don't know if he's just using rhetoric that he hopes will succeed in an election, or if he actually speaks to things he will do. I do know he's attempting to exploit the anger he sees out there to fan the flames of uncertainty that are rampant on social media. All of this matters to me very much as a journalist. It may seem that I'm crossing a line here from a disinterested reporter. I take my cues from Maria Ressa and also from Masha Gessen. Masha Gessen is a Russian reporter who now lives in the United States for her own safety. She's one of my models for how we might confront and report on the threats to civil society. She believes we need to rethink how we report on elections and on the creep of authoritarianism. She says we keep trying to describe an elephant while using the language that describes a fish. In other words, this is a completely different animal. We use the language of liberal democracy to evaluate and describe the elephant as though it has gills and scales. How can we discuss whether or not a statement is factual when the whole point of the statement is to lie? How can we find the truth of an event when truth is whatever you say it is or whatever you can get people to believe? How can we cover events when those in power are calling us liars and enemies, calling for us to be imprisoned and gleefully describing what things might be done to us behind bars, as Donald Trump has done? I know of a number of initiatives that I find hopeful. First of all, the tech giants and social media companies cannot continue to operate in an almost lawless environment, international environment. And so there are international efforts at play to limit their power. Follow the money. If they are restricted, are not allowed to sell our data, then they will be demotivated to drive us further into the arms of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Another initiative is to charge those who are threatening people online and to make those prosecutions very public. But we can also take other lessons from Ray Bradbury's story of the hapless Eccles who stumbles into a prehistoric landscape and turns the world on its head. The big message is that the political ecosystem is very fragile, but there are two other strong themes in that story. Eccles and the other time travelers are nostalgic for the past, a time when things they believe were pure and good. The advertisement for Time Safari Inc. promises a return to a place that's uncompromised. Much of the yearning for the strong man, the autocrat, is a desire for a time when those in the thrall of the dictator felt that they were empowered, when their race or point of view or family were the ones who called the shots. This is always the precondition for dictators. This is precisely what Hitler promised. But I confess I'm also nostalgic. I yearn for a time when good guys and bad guys wore obvious hats, when devils were red-eyed and not AI. It's not possible. We can't go back. Everything has changed. And we have to invent or reinvent the world in very different terms. We've done it before, but people with good hearts and minds need to be in the forefront. There's no going back. We can contribute to the reinvention. Because I think we left too many people behind in that movement that mattered to me so much as a young person. That movement toward inclusion and pluralism and tolerance was too narrow. So we have an opportunity now to not give up on the values of tolerance and pluralism, but to be more inclusive, to reinvent them forcefully and widely. The other theme in Ray Bradbury's stories come to be called the butterfly theory. The butterfly's wings represent the small acts that can have enormous consequences. So often I hear from people who say they want to get involved, to speak out, to engage, but they can't. Just reading the paper makes them crazy. And I get it. Self-care is important. But at some point, it's also the ultimate act of privilege. If you have the ability to check out, it's because you have nothing at stake. You're not fearing for your life. You're not about to be arrested. You're not about to lose your job or your rights or the ability to support your kids. You're in a position of privilege. So I urge you to stay engaged. Face the changes, see them for what they are, expand them, invent them, be part of it, identify tyranny when you see it, call out bigotry and racism, not because you need to be there for yourself, but because others need you to be there. Maria Ressa asked, what are you willing to do for the truth? So decide what role you're going to play. And maybe that flap of the butterfly wing will be undisturbed. Thank you.
So we've got time for some questions from the audience and also from anyone at home online who's watching. Please feel free to write in your questions. It sounds like the microphone's on now. Just put up your hand and I'll come to you in the audience if you have a question.
Well, thank you so much for your talk. We really appreciate it. And so I want to draw attention to one tension that you brought up in your talk, and that is, the democratic ideal of valuing a diversity of perspectives with the rise of increasingly intolerable positions like white nationalism or, say, anti-abortion perspectives. So I wonder, how do you suggest we engage with people and perspectives who we may vehemently disagree with in more meaningful ways?
Thank you. I think, going back to what Masha Gessen was saying, is that I don't know about engagement. I mean, we have to identify what these movements are doing and how they play with us, and how we try to understand them as though they are movements like other movements. They are demonstrations like, they're not. Most of them have, at least at the core of them, are political but also criminal acts. One of the things that Masha Gessen refers to is that it's as though we're covering a chess game, And we're saying, oh, someone, he's played his king, or oh, he's knocked his king over. He's knocking a pawn. What's he doing? He's knocking. No, he's not playing chess. He's throwing the chessboard on the ground. That's what we have to start coming to terms with. Is that we need new frames of reference, not just to understand them, but to explain them as journalists. As journalists, we need to start covering this differently. We need to not just call. One of the best things that happened in the past, I don't know how many years, I guess since Donald Trump, was at the beginning when Donald Trump was first lying all the time, just lying, just not like the kind of stitching a lie into the fabric, but just blatantly one after another, is it took a long time before people started saying that, before the journalists. And you notice that every time they'll say, they'll repeat something back and they say, which is found to be untrue, which is not true, which is a lie. They say this all the time now, maybe too often. But it's so important that we start to say what it was, to call these things what they are. We're not just covering someone's views or their opinions or their strategy or their policies. We're covering things that are intended to damage the things that we value. And we have to start identifying them as such and reporting them as such.
Any other questions out there? Just raise your hand and I'll come over to you. Yep, here we go.
Carol, thank you so much. I'm wondering if you have followed at all the Ministry of Truth in the Ukraine, which is a volunteer internet army that has been deployed by Zelensky to try and use those social media pathways to, the language is literally to brand Ukraine as to brand Ukraine as a moral center. And I'm thinking of this example partly because of your citation of Masha Gessen, who has taught us a lot in English about what's going on in Ukraine. And the reason I mention them is there are politics and values that are different, that are not autocratic, but connected to some of the pathways. And I think they've probably also cultivated Silicon Valley, which concerns me a great deal. But it's the question, if not in reference to the Ministry of Truth Internet Army, is about creating new valences in some of the same platforms, although platform control relies on FUD.
Yeah. I like any sort of grassroots movement. One of the things that happened with the reason why Twitter grew so quickly, especially Twitter, Facebook not so much, is the role it played in so many really wonderful things that have happened in the past 10 years. When we were trying to cover Arab Spring and Tahrir Square, Twitter was the place where people knew where to go. They knew where to run down, don't go down that street, go here, go there. It was such an incredible force. It couldn't, that movement of Arab Spring and the other revolutions that happened elsewhere couldn't have happened without the value of that. We see it in so many other movements for women, for violence against women, that they can share the knowledge of it and say, you too, that's what's happening to you, that's what's happening to me. So there's been so many valuable things, but it's the co-option of that worries me, that we're now witnessing. And the co-option is in so many different ways. First of all, Twitter was already straying before Elon Musk just took it to the other side to knock the chessboard off. And I have no idea what's going to happen to Twitter now. The other kind of alarming development about that, I'm not sure if this is happening with the Ukraine one, is that when states are the ones who are setting up these citizen things, I question this. One of the things that we know is happening, that one of the first things that Elon Musk did, is say in India, is that there has been a court case in India for some time now, because India, not only, once Modi figured out how to manipulate things through his elections through social media, he said, well, why do we let the opposition on this at all? Let's just control this. And so he started initiating this plan to bring Twitter to say that social media had to have their headquarters, if they wanted to operate in India, they had to be based in India and under Indian law. So they would control it. Facebook said, yeah, whatever. And China said, yeah, whatever. Facebook just goes wherever it's going to make money from Mark Zuckerberg. But Twitter resisted. And one of the first things that Elon Musk did is that he said, stop that. I need that market. India's the biggest market. Why are we fighting this? Do whatever they say. And so now we're starting to see another layer of co-option. And so the few things that I still valued about this, about their their democracy, the freedom to communicate with each other, is now being co-opted by these governments. I'm not saying that's Zelensky. I'm saying when we get to Ukraine, I mean, there are questions to be asked here. And the world is sort of, okay, absolutely, the bad guy, the black hat is absolutely Putin. But Ukraine is doing stuff. We know they are. We know that things are happening. And we don't know where their prisoners are going. They won't give us access to that. We have questions to ask Zelensky that we can't ask him because the whole world believes that Zelensky is wearing he's wearing a halo, not just a white hat. So where are the journalists that can do that? They can't do that yet, Just as we find it's the same thing with, journalists in many other places where they can't ask. So the illusion, it sets up this kind of this sort of image that they're able to go where they want and say what they want, but they can't because the government is controlling their voice through that social media. So I don't know that specific one. Someone just last night wrote to me about that because we're trying to figure out what we should do about them, if we should support them through Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, which is I work for. And I was just going to investigate it when I finish this. So more on that later, if that helps your answer at all with that, okay?
We've got a question from online. How much of your first-hand experience and exposure covering war-torn countries has formed and shaped your present thinking?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
I'll come closer to you.
Okay.
How much of your first-hand experience and exposure covering war-torn countries has formed and shaped your present thinking?
Lots. I think one of the things that always astonishes me when I would come back from other places and seeing things that I saw, there were times I actually got down and I kissed the ground to be back here, to be back in this country. And it was, and then I would find, and I still find, and you've probably also heard, people who say, democracy, who cares? What's it done for me? I don't care. I'm not going to vote. What's the vote going to do? Nothing. And I never hear that in countries where they don't have the vote. All you hear in countries they don't have a vote is that, oh my God, you are so lucky. You can actually vote. You actually have a voice. You have an independent media. You have this, you have... They are astonished at what we have. I only hear that we don't have that when I'm here. It is flawed. There's no question that it is not. We do not have a pure democracy. Nobody does, but we sure don't. I mean, how elections are run. We don't have, no one who wins the majority is the prime minister. We don't even get to choose the prime minister. Lots of flaws there, but it's again, as Churchill says, it's the best thing we've got. And it really, I think what disturbs me the most is how much Canadians don't appreciate what they have here.
Hi, I'm a big fan too, so I couldn't let it go without asking a question. I was very taken with your use of Masha Gessen's description of the problem being that we're describing an elephant like a fish. Mm-hmm. And I was also noting how much the Ray Bradbury story figured for you in the talk. And I just wanted to ask you about the importance of storytellers or fiction writers, I guess, as helping us be able to see truly in a time when, the assault on truth and facts is sort of the name of the game. Like, how important are those figures? I guess I had also a kind of a sidebar question about, the question of futurism and what we can borrow from, the Black liberation movement and the power of thinking about futurism as a way forward also. Mm-hmm. As opposed to a nostalgia for the past. All
right, I'll try, because I think there's kind of two questions there. As I said at the very beginning, there's two parts of me. One was in arts and humanities when I was here, and the other was in journalism. And I've said before, I could not have made sense of the world had I not studied literature. I mean, I would not understand Donald Trump if it wasn't for Shakespeare's Richard III. That is that's the narrative arc. there are meta-narratives we know, and we absorb them just as humans, as individuals, we all have them. But I think that you can make sense of so many things through that. And the Ray Bradbury short story came to me so many times. I thought, there's somewhere a butterfly just got stepped on. But I've always, there's just so much from literature that I've come to understand, and I keep seeing those patterns repeated, and I understand them through those patterns. And perhaps I don't feel as much despair, because I think that it doesn't mean that things turn out well. They didn't for Richard, and maybe not for Donald either. But I think that we can understand things more deeply. We understand we share these experiences, and that you can find narrative arcs that can express that, and that other people can say, oh, I know what you're talking about. That was always the hardest thing when we had to do international stories. I was told by, I was told this many times in different ways, but very directly by when I was covering international wars. And our assignment executive said, people don't care about this. They don't care about this. You have to find a way to make people care about these foreign faces, these brown people, these people in other places. That we don't, you have to, and so in their wisdom, they figured what should happen is that the reporter should be in every shot. So I should be there because they like me, I'm a white woman, and they trust me, and they'll feel more comfortable. Like I kid you not. And I never did. I just accidentally wasn't in the shot all the time. And that was a fight we had. You'll notice that happens a lot now. If you watch TV news, you watch that they're covering foreign stories, the reporter jumps into the frame constantly. And that's because of this idea that people aren't comfortable with the other. It's actually, they never say it overtly, but that's what it's from. And I think that the idea is that I have to find a way to tell the story that would make people care. That was always my ambition. That's why I loved As It Happens, because I found I was able, that was definitely a place where I could find you could make people care about stories, other people. It just lent itself to that, and it was so wonderful for those 16 years.
We've got time for one last question.
You've traveled the world and observed that people in far-off places are fighting desperately to be able to vote in the hope that their vote will bring change and value to their lives. But here in Canada, the proportion of our population that bothers to vote is rapidly approaching something near zero. Yeah. I don't understand it. I wonder if you do. And if you do, as a journalist, what do you think you and your colleagues can do about it? Mm-hmm. This university, many years ago, had a school of journalism, which it almost lost, but it didn't. So here at Western, journalism seems to be important. Mm-hmm. Can you encourage the people who aspire to that lofty role to do something about our fellow citizens who think they won't bother to vote? Mm-hmm. They'll just park trucks in Ottawa.
Thank you for that question. I think a couple of things. First of all, I think journalists are not doing a very good job of explaining things. I think what happens, especially, I was in Ottawa as a correspondent on the Hill for a couple of years until I left with my hair on fire from the friction of moving so quickly. It was just the worst experience I ever had. And everybody is so in bed with each other. I mean, everybody is just drinking each other's bathwater all the time. And I think they lose all perspective of what people are really going through. So I think the first failing is that we don't translate that to people. What are the issues? Why should you care? I think we do a bad job at that. And I think a lot of it has to do, with the way we want reporters to be really informed, to be able to ask informed questions. But when they get to the point where they can't, they are carefully moderating their questions so they don't offend the politician they need to get on the show next week. We have a problem. But I think the politicians are drinking the same bathwater, and they have lost an understanding of what's at issue, what people are going through. And they say that we want to get back to with real people and real issues. I don't believe those people either. I don't think they get a sense of what people are going through. I just came to the university in a taxi talking to a man who was, we came into the campus and he said, he said, university's okay, but I said, there's some bad stuff goes on here, some bad teaching. I said, well, this Ivy Business School, they teach young people how to lie and steal. I think, oh, okay, so that's what they teach them that. And then so he started going through other faculties. So of course I had to ask him, what about journalism? He said, oh, yeah, journalism, that's a sad thing. He said, there's just so much fake news. You just don't, you don't know what to believe. And I'm thinking, we're finally finding a place to share here. And I said, so who would you consider to be fake news? He said, CNN's the worst. CNN has the most fake news. BBC is far worse. BBC is the worst for fake news. And then CBC, and I said, well, why do you think they do? She said, well, because they want to tell you the story, but they said the government won't let them. And I think, I don't even know where to begin. And I thought, how many people, I think he's kind of extreme, but I think some people don't even understand how these different parts of their society work, or they're supposed to work. And I think we do a really, really bad job at showing who we are, what we're supposed to do, and explaining things. Because we're going to take 1.5 million new immigrants in the next 3 years, right? Let's do a better job of including them in things and explaining what we do and explaining what this society is about. Because I think people throw them in and they have to figure it out for themselves. Though I have to say, the immigrants are usually the people who are voting, and the people who have been here for generations are the ones who think, meh, why bother? So I think we have failed people so many times in this, and I think the politicians fail them, journalism fails them, and the elites, not the university though. University's not failing anybody. I didn't say that. But anyway, I thank you for that question. I think it's really, really important.
Thank you, everybody at home watching online, and also everybody today for joining us.